The Erebus drifted through a cloud of purple and gold dust that stretched across the void like a curtain between worlds, and Captain Marin Voss stood at the observation window watching it swirl around her ship like something alive. She had not slept in 30 hours, but sleep could wait, because the nebula they had entered was more beautiful than anything she had ever seen in her 12 years of service with the Terran Expeditionary Corps. "Captain, sensors are picking up unusual energy signatures ahead," said Lieutenant Kaida Osei from the scanning station, her voice calm but carrying an edge that Voss had learned to pay attention to. Voss turned from the window and walked to the central command table, where a holographic map of the region floated in pale blue light. "What kind of signatures?" she asked. "Artificial," Kaida replied. "Beacon markers, navigation buoys, and what looks like a sensor grid stretched across the entire mouth of the nebula." Felt something cold settle in her stomach, because beacon markers and sensor grids meant territory, and territory meant someone had claimed this stretch of space long before humans had ever looked up at the stars. The Erebus was not a warship, and it was never meant to be one, because it was a retrofitted survey cruiser carrying a crew of 43 men and women whose mission was simple: go further than any human ship had gone before, map what you find, and come home. They carried modest point defense guns and a single experimental weapon that nobody on board had ever fired, and that most of the crew tried not to think about, because the Cascade Lance was a thing that made even the engineers who maintained it uncomfortable. "Pull up the Conclave territorial registries," Voss ordered. Kaida worked the console, and a moment later, the map shifted, overlaying colored zones across the nebula and the space around it, and every single color belonged to someone who was not human. "We are inside the Veil of Sorthal," Kaida said quietly. "Sacred territory under the joint protection of the Conclave of 12. Voss closed her eyes for a moment, because this was exactly the kind of situation that could turn a simple exploration mission into an interstellar incident, and humanity could not afford an interstellar incident. The Conclave of 12 was the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, an alliance of 12 elder species who had been traveling between stars when humans were still figuring out how to make fire. And they looked at humanity the way a grown person might look at a toddler who had wandered into a boardroom, with a mixture of amusement and irritation. Humans had been classified as a juvenile species, which was a polite way of saying that the galaxy did not take them seriously, and Voss had spent her entire career swallowing that particular insult with a smile. "Helm, bring us about," Voss commanded, "leaving the way we came in. And we are doing it right now." But the stars had other plans. 3 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly ahead of the Erebus, and they were not small, and they were not friendly. The Vathari frigates were sleek predatory things that looked like blades made of dark metal and living crystal, and they fanned out into an attack formation with the practiced ease of hunters who had done this 1,000 times before. "We are being hailed," said Communications Officer Davi Montero. "Put it through," Voss said. The face that appeared on the main screen was not human in any sense of the word, because Admiral Zhel Khan of the Vathari Border Command had 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on a face that was all sharp angles and pale blue skin, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of someone who had never been told no. "Under Article 9 of the Conclave Territorial Accord, you and your crew are hereby ordered to power down all systems and prepare to be boarded and archived." Archived. The word hit Voss like a fist, because she knew what it meant. Permanent stasis imprisonment, where you were frozen alive and stored in a vault somewhere deep underground, and you stayed there forever. Not dead, but not alive either. Just frozen in a moment of terror for eternity. "Admiral Zhel Khan," Voss replied, keeping her voice steady, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "We entered this space by accident, during a survey mission, and we are already in the process of withdrawing, so I respectfully request that you allow us to leave peacefully, and we can both pretend this never happened." Jelkon's 4 eyes blinked, one pair at a time. "Your request is denied," he said. "Juvenile species do not make requests inside sacred space, and your ignorance of our borders does not excuse your trespass, so you will power down your systems now, or we will disable your ship and take you by force." Voss looked around her bridge, at the faces of her crew. Kaida at sensors with her jaw clenched tight. Davi at communications with fear in his eyes, but his hands steady on the console. Tomas Reyes, the chief engineer, watching from the doorway with his arms crossed and a look on his face that said he already knew what was coming. She thought about the 43 people on this ship who had families waiting for them back home, who had signed up to explore the unknown and not to die in it. "I will not surrender my crew to Archival," Voss said, and her voice was quiet, but it filled the bridge like thunder. "Not today, and not ever." Jelkon stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his 4 eyes. Not respect exactly, but perhaps a flicker of surprise that this small creature on this small ship would dare to refuse him. "Chosen your fate," he said, and the transmission cut to black. The first volley hit the Erebus like a hammer, and the ship screamed as energy blasts tore into her forward shields, and Voss grabbed the command rail as the deck lurched beneath her feet. "Shields at 60%, Kaida shouted over the alarms. "Helm, evasive pattern Delta," Voss ordered. "Tomas, I need the lance." Tomas Reyes looked at her with wide eyes, because nobody had ever fired the Cascade Lance outside of a laboratory, and the theoretical model suggested it could do things to the fabric of space that made physicists lose sleep. "Captain, we have never tested it in combat, and I cannot guarantee." "Tomas," Voss cut him off. "They are going to kill us or worse, so give me the lance now." He ran. The Erebus twisted and rolled through space as the 3 Vathari frigates closed in, their weapons lighting up the void with streaks of blue fire, and Voss felt each impact shudder through the hull like a dying heartbeat. "Lance is charging," Tomas called over the intercom, his voice breathless. 30 seconds. "We do not have 30 seconds, Voss muttered. She pushed the ship harder, diving beneath the lead frigate, and pulling a turn so tight that the inertial dampeners groaned in protest, and for a moment she was behind them, and they were scrambling to reacquire her. "Lance is ready. Fire." What happened next would be talked about across the galaxy for 100 years. The Cascade Lance activated, and a beam of impossible light erupted from the belly of the Erebus. Not a laser, and not plasma, but something that bent the eye and twisted the mind, because it was a focused stream of gravitational force compressed into a needle-thin lance that struck the lead Vathari frigate dead center. The frigate did not explode, because explosion would have been merciful, and instead the ship simply came apart at the atomic level. Every molecule in its hull was pulled in a different direction at the same time, and for one terrible, beautiful instant, the frigate became a cloud of shimmering dust that hung in space like a memorial to everything it had been. The other 2 frigates broke formation and ran. Voss stood on her shattered bridge, surrounded by sparking consoles and flickering lights, and the moans of wounded crew members. And she watched the enemy ships flee into the dark. "Get us out of here," she whispered. "Maximum speed, any direction, just go." The Erebus limped away into the void, trailing smoke and debris, and behind them, Admiral Jelkon sat in the command chair of his surviving frigate, with all 4 eyes wide and his hands trembling as he opened a priority channel to the Conclave High Chamber. "A juvenile species has fired a Tier 0 weapon inside the Veil," he said, and his voice carried a fury that burned cold enough to freeze stars. "Extermination Armada." The signal raced across the galaxy at the speed of light, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Conclave High Chamber was a room built to make every living creature feel small, and it succeeded at this task with a perfection that bordered on cruelty. The chamber sat at the heart of Aethys Prime, the ancient throne world, where the 12 elder species had gathered to rule the galaxy for longer than most civilizations had existed. And its walls rose so high that they disappeared into a ceiling of artificial stars that mirrored the real ones burning outside. 12 seats arranged in a circle, each one designed for a different anatomy, each one occupied by a representative who carried the weight of an entire species on their shoulders. And today, every one of them was afraid, even though none of them would admit it. "The recording has been verified 7 times, said Jelkon's holographic image from the center of the chamber. The human vessel deployed a weapon that disassembled a Vathari frigate at the molecular level. That this is consistent with gravitational shear manipulation, which places it firmly within Tier 0 classification." The words hung in the air like poison, because Tier 0 weapons were the great equalizer. The terrible fire that only the oldest and most powerful species were supposed to possess, and the idea that humans who had been stumbling around in space for barely 400 years, could wield such power was enough to crack the foundations of everything the Conclave believed about the natural order. Cephas of the Aldrani leaned forward in her seat, and her long silver face caught the light of the artificial stars above. And she was old, even by the standards of a species that measured time in millennia. "Before we proceed down a path from which there is no return," she said, her voice carrying the careful weight of someone who chose every word, like a surgeon chose a blade, "I would like to ask a simple question. Did the humans attack first, or did we?" Silence fell across the chamber like a blanket. Jelkon's holographic jaw tightened. The humans violated sacred space, and when lawfully ordered to surrender, they refused and opened fire on Conclave vessels. "That is not what I asked," Cephas replied. "I asked who fired first, and I believe the sensor logs will show that your frigates initiated the attack, after the human captain had already offered to withdraw peacefully." "The law required their arrest," Jelkon snapped. "The law required their arrest," Cephas agreed, "but the law did not require you to fire on a retreating vessel, and it certainly did not anticipate that the vessel you fired upon would be carrying a weapon capable of answering back." The chamber erupted into argument, because that was what the Conclave did best, when it was frightened. And species that had cooperated for thousands of years suddenly remembered all the reasons they distrusted each other. Vathari wanted blood, because a Vathari ship had been destroyed, and Vathari pride demanded an answer that could only be written in fire. The Kreth Dominion, insectoid creatures who thought in swarm logic, and saw every other species as either predator or prey, sided with the Vathari, because a juvenile species with Tier 0 weapons was a predator that needed to be eliminated before it grew any stronger. The Polari Network, beings who had merged their consciousness with machines so long ago that nobody remembered what they had looked like before, calculated the odds, and decided that humanity was a variable that needed to be removed from the equation. But Cephas and her allies, the Venari, the Oruk, and 2 others, argued for restraint, because destroying a species over a border incident was not justice, it was genocide. And the Conclave had survived this long because it had rules. The vote came down to 7 against 5 in favor of military action. Cephas watched it happen, with a heaviness in her chest that felt like mourning. "Then let the record show," she said, as the chamber began to empty, "that the Conclave of 12 voted to deploy an extermination armada against a single ship and a species that asked only to be allowed to leave in peace. And let the record show that I told you this would be a mistake you could not undo. Nobody listened, because nobody ever listened to the voice of reason when fear was shouting louder." The Armada assembled in the deep void beyond the Vale of Sorthal, and it was a thing of terrible beauty. 482 warships, drawn from 7 species, carrying enough firepower to crack a planet open like an egg. Vathari dreadnoughts, with their blade-shaped hulls and crystal weapon arrays, Kreth carrier swarms that moved like living clouds of razor-edged metal, Polari siege platforms that were more computer than ship, and dozens of other vessels from species who had, joined the hunt because the Conclave had asked, and because saying no to the Conclave was something that simply was not done. It was the largest military mobilization in 6,000 years, and all of it was aimed at one broken ship with 43 humans aboard. At the center of the Armada, Admiral Jelkon stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the Throne of Silence, which was the largest warship the Vaethari had ever built, and he stared at the star maps with all four of his eyes burning with a cold and patient hatred. He would find the human ship, and he would destroy it. And then he would go to their homeworld, and he would make an example that the galaxy would remember for 10,000 years. Meanwhile, in a dead star system, 300 light-years away, the Erebus was dying. The ship hung in the shadow of a burned-out star, her hull scarred and torn, atmosphere leaking from a dozen breaches that the crew had patched with emergency sealant and prayer. Half her systems were running on backup power, because the primary reactor had been damaged in the fight. Captain Maren Voss sat in her quarters with a medical patch on her ribs where a piece of shrapnel had tried to kill her, and she was reading the sensor data that Kaida had compiled, and what the data told her was very simple. They were coming, and they were bringing everything. 482 ships, Tomas said from the doorway, and his voice was hollow, in the way that voices get when the mind behind them has processed something too large and too terrible to hold. I can count, Voss said. The lance is burned out, and even if I could fix it, we only have enough power for maybe 2 shots before the reactor gives up completely. I know. Voss looked at him, and in that moment she was not a captain, and he was not an engineer. They were just 2 human beings very far from home, staring at the end of everything. Had ever known. I sent a signal to Earth, she said. Emergency protocol, full encryption, everything I had. That signal will take weeks to arrive, he said. Maybe, she said. Maybe not. Tomas frowned, because he did not understand what she meant, and Voss did not explain, because there were things she knew that she had never been authorized to share. Things about humanity's contingency plans that existed in files so classified that even admirals did not have access. She stood up and winced as her ribs reminded her that they were broken. Here is what we do, she said. We do not run because there is nowhere to run to, and we do not hide because they will find us, and we do not surrender because we know what surrender means. Then what? We find a place where the terrain favors us, and we make them pay for every inch of space they try to take, and we buy time, because time is the only currency we have left. Laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because sometimes when a human being is pushed to the very edge of what they can endure, something breaks loose inside them, and the fear falls away, and what is left underneath is something old and hard and unbreakable. You are insane, he said. I am human, she replied. Same thing. She walked to the bridge where her surviving crew was waiting, and they looked at her with eyes that held fear and exhaustion and something else, something that burned like a small flame refusing to go out in a hurricane. Listen to me, she said, and her voice was not loud, but every person on that bridge heard her, as clearly as if she had spoken directly into their souls. They are sending an armada because they are afraid of what we represent, and they should be afraid, because we are the species that learned to make fire in a world that wanted us dead. We are the species that crossed oceans in boats made of wood. We are the species that looked at the void between stars and said, yes, we can cross that too. She paused and looked at each of them one by one. They have 482 ships, and we have 1. And I am not going to stand here and tell you that those are good odds, because they are not. But I will tell you this. We are going to make them remember this fight for the rest of galactic history. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Kaida Osei straightened in her seat and said, Where are we going, Captain? Voss smiled, and it was the kind of smile that wolves give to the dark. The Cathara Void, she said. It is a dead star system full of asteroid fields and neutron star remnants and gravitational anomalies. And it is going to be the worst place in the galaxy to fight a battle if you are flying a big, expensive warship. She turned to the helm. Set a course and push the engines as hard as they will go, because we have a lot of work to do before our guests arrive. The Erebus turned its broken nose toward the darkness and began to move. And behind it, the Armada was already on its way. The Kethera Void was a graveyard of stars, and it was exactly what Marin Voss needed. 2 dead neutron stars sat at the center of the system, spinning around each other in a slow and eternal dance. And the gravitational forces they created turned the space around them into a maze of invisible currents that could grab a ship and fling it into an asteroid or crush it flat without warning. Millions of asteroids filled the system in dense belts and scattered clouds, some of them the size of mountains and some of them the size of cities, all of them tumbling through the dark in unpredictable patterns that made navigation a nightmare. Radiation pockets bloomed and faded like deadly flowers. Sensor-blind zones stretched across entire sectors, and gravitational eddies could pull a ship off course so violently that the crew inside would be turned to paste against the walls. It was the most dangerous system within 100 light-years, and Voss had spent 4 days learning every inch of it. She had sent survey drones into the asteroid fields to map every rock and every gap between the rocks. She had charted the radiation blooms and timed their cycles. She had calculated the gravitational currents and figured out where they pushed and where they pulled. And she had turned all of this information into a weapon. "The drones are in position," Tomas reported from engineering, his voice crackling through a communication system that was held together with emergency patches and stubbornness. Voss nodded from the bridge, where the holographic map now showed the entire Kethera Void in glowing detail, with every trap she had laid marked in red. 47 survey drones, reprogrammed as proximity-triggered electromagnetic pulse charges, hidden inside asteroids across 3 different choke points. 14 asteroids, rigged with the ship's emergency fuel reserves, turned into floating bombs that could be detonated remotely. Signatures planted in 6 locations to make the enemy think the Erebus was somewhere it was not. And the Cascade Lance, damaged and drained, holding enough power for exactly 1 shot that Tomas could not guarantee would work. "It is not much," Kaida said, looking at the map. "It doesn't need to be much," Voss replied. "It needs to be enough." The Armada arrived on the 5th day. 482 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kethera Void, and the sight of them would have made gods tremble, because they filled the darkness like a second sky, their running lights creating a constellation of cold and purposeful stars. Admiral Zelkan stood on the bridge of the Throne of Silence and surveyed the system ahead with contempt. "One ship," he said, "hiding in a field of rocks, like a wounded animal. And this is what we mobilized an Armada for." "Admiral," his tactical officer said carefully, "the system is extremely hazardous, and our navigation charts show multiple gravitational anomalies that could—" "Send the destroyer squadrons in first," Zelkan ordered. "Flush the animal from its hole." The first squadron of 12 Vathari destroyers entered the asteroid field in a tight formation, their sensors sweeping ahead, their weapons charged and ready. And they were confident, because each one of them carried enough firepower to level a small moon, and they were hunting a single broken survey ship. They never saw it coming. Voss watched from the shadow of a dead asteroid, as the destroyers moved into the first choke point, a narrow corridor between 2 massive rock formations, where the gravitational currents funneled everything into a single path. "Wait," she whispered. The destroyers moved deeper. "Wait." They reached the center of the corridor. Now, she fired the Cascade Lance, not at the ships, but at the asteroid above them. And the gravitational shear did not destroy the rock, because the lance was too weak for that. But it did something worse. It destabilized the asteroid's structural integrity at the molecular level, and the rock began to break apart, not in one piece, but in 10,000 pieces, that cascaded outward in a chain reaction that hit the neighboring asteroids and broke those apart too. In the span of 3 seconds, the corridor became a storm of debris, moving at thousands of meters per second, and the 12 destroyers were caught in the middle of it, like insects in a blender. 7 were destroyed outright, torn apart by impacts that their shields could not handle, because shields were designed to stop weapons fire, not a million tons of rock moving at relativistic speeds. 3 were crippled, their engines dead, and their hulls breached, and their crews scrambling for survival. 2 managed to escape, and they fled back to the Armada, carrying sensor recordings that would make Admiral Gel Khan's 4 eyes go wide. She collapsed the corridor, his tactical officer reported, with something close to awe in his voice. She used the gravitational weapon on the environment itself. Gel Khan said nothing for a long time. Then, he sent the Kreth carrier swarm. The Kreth fought differently than the Vathari because they used thousands of small drone fighters, controlled by a hive mind intelligence, and they poured into the asteroid field like a flood of metal wasps, filling every gap and every shadow with sensors and weapons. Voss had expected this, and she had prepared for it. The reprogrammed survey drones activated as the Kreth swarm passed their hiding places, and 47 electromagnetic pulse charges detonated in sequence across 3 different sectors, and the effect was devastating, because the Kreth drones were networked together, and the EMP did not just disable the drones it hit, it sent a feedback surge through the network that knocked out every drone within range of the signal. Thousands of Kreth fighters went dark in an instant, tumbling through the asteroid field like dead leaves, and the carrier ships that controlled them suddenly found themselves blind and exposed in hostile territory. Voss struck. The Erebus came screaming out of a radiation pocket where it had been hiding, invisible to sensors, and it hit the lead Kreth carrier with everything it had. Point defense guns, repurposed as assault weapons, emergency fuel bombs detonated against the carrier's hull, and a ramming maneuver that sheared off the carrier's main antenna array before Voss pulled away into the asteroids again. The carrier tumbled out of control and crashed into an asteroid and exploded, and the remaining carriers retreated in disarray. 12 hours into the battle, and the Armada had lost 31 ships without ever getting a clear shot at the Erebus. Gel Khan was no longer contemptuous, sent a full battle group, 60 warships, including 2 Polaris siege platforms, into the void, with orders to blanket the area with fire and destroy every asteroid the Erebus could hide behind. This was the hardest part. Voss could not hide from 60 ships that were willing to destroy the terrain itself, so she stopped hiding and started moving, pushing the Erebus through gaps in the asteroid field that were barely wider than the ship itself, using the gravitational currents to slingshot around corners at speeds that made her crew scream, staying one step ahead of the bombardment that was turning the Kethera void into a hellscape of fire and shattered rock. She lost people. A hull breach in the lower decks killed 4 crew members before it could be sealed, and the ship's medic, Dr. Anara Patel, worked in a medical bay that had no power and no gravity, keeping the wounded alive through skill and desperation and a refusal to let anyone die on her watch. Montero was hit by shrapnel when his console exploded and he lost his left hand, but he stayed at his post because the communications array was the only thing keeping the false sensor signatures active, and without those, the enemy would find the Erebus in minutes. Tomas Reyes worked in an engineering section that was on fire, rerouting power through systems that were never designed to carry it, keeping the engines running through a combination of genius and what he later described as aggressive negotiation with the laws of physics. And through all of it, Voss flew. She flew her broken ship through the graveyard of stars like she had been born in the cockpit, reading the gravitational currents by instinct, predicting where the asteroids would be before they got there, finding paths through the chaos that the enemy tactical computers said did not exist. At the 36-hour mark, she did something that no one on either side expected. Positioned itself at the edge of a clear zone, pouring fire into the asteroid field, and it was too well shielded to be damaged by anything the Erebus carried. So Voss flew straight at it. The Erebus came out of the asteroids at full speed, aimed directly at the siege platform like a bullet, and the platform's gunners opened fire, but Voss jinked and rolled and twisted through the barrage with a precision that bordered on the impossible. She hit the siege platform, not with weapons, but with the ship itself, driving the Erebus into the platform's hull with a controlled collision that buried the bow of her ship in the enemy's armor. And then she fired the Cascade Lance at point-blank range, directly into the guts of the siege platform. The lance had barely any power left, but at zero distance, it did not need much. The gravitational shear tore through the siege platform's interior, and then something went wrong. Or perhaps something went exactly right. The energy interacted with the platform's own power core, and the resulting explosion warped local spacetime in a sphere half a kilometer wide. Every ship within that sphere was disabled instantly. Their systems scrambled by the spacetime distortion, and 23 Conclave warships went dark in a single moment. Voss pulled the Erebus free from the wreckage with engines that were barely functioning and a hull that was more patch than metal, and she retreated into the deep asteroids to hide and bleed and count her dead. 72 hours. 94 Conclave warships destroyed or disabled. 21 of her 43 crew dead. The Erebus was finished, and Voss knew it, because the engines were failing, and the life support was failing, and the weapons were gone, and there was nothing left except a crew of 22 broken and exhausted humans floating in a dying ship in the dark. Zelkon regrouped his remaining ships and prepared for the final push. And this time there would be no tricks and no traps, because there was nothing left to fight with. Voss sat in her command chair, with blood on her face, and her broken ribs screaming with every breath, and she looked at the sensor display that showed the Armada forming up for the kill. "It was a good fight," Kaida said softly from beside her. "It is not over yet," Voss whispered, though she did not know why she said it. And then the sensors screamed. A massive energy signature appeared at the edge of the Cathara void, something so powerful that it overwhelmed the damaged sensor array and filled the display with white light. And it was not one signature, but 12, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. On the bridge of the Throne of Silence, Admiral Zelkon stared at his tactical display as 12 unknown contacts appeared where nothing had been a moment before, and each one of them was radiating more energy than A. "What is that?" he whispered. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. 6 days earlier, the signal had left the Erebus as a compressed burst of encrypted data fired into the void on a frequency that was not supposed to exist, aimed at a point in empty space where nothing should have been listening. But something was listening. 47 light-years from the Cathara void, a device no bigger than a coffin floated in the absolute darkness between stars, and it had been floating there for 11 years, waiting for a signal exactly like this one. It was a quantum-entangled relay buoy, one of hundreds that humanity had secretly scattered across the galaxy over the past 3 decades, hidden in the gaps between systems where nobody ever looked because there was nothing there worth looking at. The buoy received the signal from the Erebus, and in the same instant, not at the speed of light, but instantly, because quantum entanglement did not care about distance, it transmitted that signal to another buoy 19 light-years closer to Earth, which transmitted it to another, which transmitted it to another. And in 6 hours and 14 minutes, Captain Marin Voss's emergency distress call was sitting on a screen in a room beneath the surface of the moon that did not officially exist. Admiral Constance Joe read the message 3 times. Then she picked up a communication device and spoke 4 words that activated a program so secret that fewer than 200 humans in all of existence knew it was real. Wake up the Phalanx. The Phalanx was humanity's hidden hand, 12 ships that had been built in secret over 20 years in shipyards carved into asteroids in the deep outer system, where no conclave sensor could reach. They were not exploration vessels, and they were not patrol ships, and they were not anything that the galaxy had ever seen before, because they had been designed from the ground up with a single purpose: to fight a war against an enemy that outnumbered humanity 1,000 to 1. And to win. Each ship carried a full array of Cascade Lances, not 1 prototype, but 8 production models, refined and perfected in laboratories that the Conclave did not know existed. Each ship was driven by a reactor that generated more power than some elder species could produce with an entire fleet. And the physics behind those reactors came from research that humans had conducted in secret, building on the work of the Cascade Lance and pushing it further and deeper into territories of science that the elder species had declared forbidden millennia ago. The elder species had declared those areas of research forbidden not because the science was impossible, but because it was too dangerous and too powerful. And they had assumed that no species would be reckless enough to pursue it anyway. They had not accounted for humans. The 12 ships launched from their hidden berths and formed up in the darkness beyond Neptune, and their commander was Captain Admiral Helena Vasquez, a woman who had spent her entire military career preparing for a day she had prayed would never come. Heard her executive officers speak. All ships report combat ready. Vasquez looked at the tactical display, showing the location of the Kethara Void and the estimated position of the Conclave Armada, and she felt the weight of what was about to happen settle onto her shoulders like a mountain. Set course for the Kethara Void, she ordered. Maximum speed. The Phalanx entered faster than light travel, and the stars stretched into lines of light around them. Back in the Kethara Void, the 12 ships dropped out of FTL in perfect formation, and the energy they released as they decelerated was so enormous that it lit up every sensor array in the system, like a sunrise. On the dying bridge of the Erebus, Kaida Osei stared at her sensor display with tears running down her face. "Captain," she said, and her voice broke on the, "Those are human ships." Voss looked at the display, and for a moment she could not breathe, because she had hoped, she had desperately hoped, but she had not truly believed it would happen. And now there they were, 12 points of light, burning in the darkness like 12 small suns. "The signal was received," she whispered. "Conclave Armada, this is Captain Admiral Helena Vasquez of the Terran Phalanx." A voice rang out across every communication frequency in the system, clear and strong, and carrying an authority that made even Gelcon pause. "You have attacked a Terran vessel engaged in peaceful exploration, and you have killed Terran citizens, and you are hereby ordered to withdraw from this system immediately, or face the consequences." Gelcon's response was to order his entire remaining fleet to attack. It was the last mistake he ever made. The Phalanx moved like nothing the galaxy had ever seen, because human military doctrine was not built on the rigid formations and predictable patterns that the elder species had used for millennia. It was built on chaos theory, on the understanding that battle was not an equation to be solved, but a storm to be ridden, and that the side which could adapt fastest would always win. The 12 ships broke formation and scattered, each one moving independently, but in perfect coordination, communicating through quantum-linked systems that allowed them to share information and react as a single organism spread across millions of kilometers of space. The Conclave tactical computers tried to predict their movements and failed, because the algorithms were based on patterns and the Phalanx did not follow patterns. They improvised, they adapted, they made decisions in fractions of a second that no program system could anticipate, because human intuition was something that could not be coded. The first Cascade Lance volley struck a Vefari battle group, and 3 dreadnoughts ceased to exist. The Conclave ships fired back with everything they had, but the Phalanx ships were fast, and their pilots were skilled, and they twisted through the incoming fire with the same desperate agility that Voss had shown in the asteroid field. Except they were not desperate at all. They were methodical. A Polari siege platform tried to engage 2 Phalanx ships at once, and the 2 ships split apart, drew the platform's fire in opposite directions, and then a 3rd Phalanx ship appeared from behind an asteroid and put 2 Cascade Lance beams through its reactor core. A Kreth carrier swarm launched 10,000 drone fighters at the Phalanx, and the Phalanx did not even bother to dodge. They simply activated their point defense systems, which were not guns, but localized gravitational fields that turned the drones into compressed balls of metal smaller than a fist. Ship after ship after ship, the Conclave Armada was being taken apart by 12 vessels that fought with a creativity and ferocity that the elder species had no framework to understand, because in all their millennia of warfare, they had never encountered an enemy that treated combat as an art form. Humans did not fight like machines, and they did not fight like swarms, and they did not fight like any of the elder species. They fought like humans, which meant they fought with imagination, and anger, and love, and fear, and every other messy, contradictory emotion that made them the most unpredictable species the galaxy had ever produced. On the Erebus, the surviving crew watched in silence as the battle unfolded on their flickering sensors, and one by one they began to cry, not from sadness, but from something that had no name, something that lived in the space between relief and awe, and a fierce burning pride that filled their chests until it hurt. The Armada broke. It did not break all at once, but it broke the way things break when the foundation ends. Cracks. First 1 ship turned and ran, then 3, then a dozen, and then entire squadrons were fleeing the system without waiting for orders, because the chain of command had been shattered, along with the myth that the elder species could not be beaten. Surrender signals began appearing on every frequency as Conclave ships powered down their weapons and begged for mercy from an enemy they had come to exterminate. But Admiral Gel Khan did not surrender. He stood on the bridge of the Throne of Silence with his 4 eyes burning and his hands locked around the command rail, and he stared at the Erebus drifting in the asteroid field. The little broken ship that had started all of this, and something inside him, something that was not rational and was not tactical, but was pure and absolute hatred, made his decision for him. All power to engines, he ordered. Ram the human vessel. The Throne of Silence surged forward, its massive engines firing at maximum thrust, driving the flagship directly at the Erebus, like a spear thrown by a god. Voss saw it coming on her sensors, and she could not move, because the Erebus had nothing left, no engines, and no weapons, and no shields, and the flagship was closing the distance at a speed that left no time to think. Phalanx Actual, she said into the communications channel, and her voice was calm in the way that the center of a hurricane is calm. I need a favor. Helena Vasquez's voice came back instantly. We see him. Erebus, hold tight. 3 Phalanx ships converged on the Throne of Silence from 3 different angles, and they synchronized their Cascade Lance arrays through the quantum link, timing the shot to the nanosecond so that 3 beams would strike the same point on the flagship at the exact same moment. The beams fired. They hit the Throne of Silence amidships, and the combined gravitational shear was so intense that it did not just destroy the flagship. It folded it, compressing the massive ship into a space smaller than a house, in an instant so brief that Gel Khan never had time to understand what was happening. The Throne of Silence vanished as if it had never existed, and the shockwave from its destruction rippled outward through the Kethera void, and every ship in the system felt it shudder through their hulls, like the toll of a bell. Silence fell across the battlefield. The Conclave Armada was finished. Of the 482 ships that had come to destroy one human vessel, 213 were destroyed or disabled, and the rest were scattered across 3 star systems in a state of disorganized retreat. The phalanx moved through the wreckage with quiet efficiency, securing the surrendered ships, and sending rescue teams to vessels that were drifting without power, because humans fought without mercy, but they did not leave their enemies to die in the void. That was the difference. That was always the difference. A phalanx shuttle docked with the Erebus, and when the airlock opened, Helena Vasquez stepped through and found Marin Voss standing on her shattered bridge with blood dried on her face and her arm in a makeshift sling, and her crew gathered around her like survivors of a shipwreck. Vasquez saluted. Voss tried to salute back, and winced, and smiled instead. "You took your time," Voss said. "Traffic was terrible," Vasquez replied. And then they both laughed, because sometimes that was all you could do when the impossible had happened, and you were still alive to talk about it. But across the galaxy, the laughter had not started yet, because what had happened in the Cathara Void was being broadcast on every communication network, and every species in the Conclave was watching the recordings of 12 human ships dismantling the most powerful military force assembled in 6,000 years. And they were afraid. Weapons. And not of the ships, but of something deeper and harder to define. They were afraid of what it meant, that a species they had dismissed as children had been building these things in secret for decades, preparing for a war they hoped would never come, but were ready to fight if it did. They were afraid, because they were beginning to understand that they had never really known what humans were, and that was the most frightening thing of all. The news spread across the galaxy the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast and unstoppable, and leaving nothing unchanged in its wake. Within hours of the battle's end, every species in the Conclave had seen the recordings, and the recordings showed everything. The lone Erebus fighting for 72 hours against impossible odds, the arrival of the phalanx, the systematic destruction of the most powerful fleet assembled in 6,000 years, and the final moment when the throne of silence was compressed into nothing by 3 beams of light that bent the laws of physics like wet paper. On Aethys Prime, the Conclave High Chamber descended into chaos. Representatives screamed at each other in languages that had been old when Earth's dinosaurs were young, and alliances that had held for millennia shattered in the span of a single session, because the vote that had sent the Armada was now a chain around every neck that had supported it. Representative tried to call for a second mobilization and was shouted down by 8 voices at once. "You want to send another Armada," Cephas of the Aldrani said, standing in her seat with her silver face hard and cold. After the first one lost 213 ships to 12 enemy vessels and a survey cruiser, you want to send more of our people to die against an enemy that was clearly prepared for a war we did not know was possible. "They are a juvenile species," the Vathari representative snarled. "They cannot be allowed to." "They are not a juvenile species," Cephas cut him off, and her voice carried a weight that silenced the entire chamber. "They stopped being a juvenile species the moment one of their captains held off our entire armada for 3 days with 43 crew members and a broken ship. And if we are honest with ourselves, they were never a juvenile species at all. We simply told ourselves they were because it was easier than admitting that we were afraid of what they might become." The chamber was silent. "The Aldrani withdraw from the conclave," Cephas said. The words fell like stones into deep water. "The Thanari also withdraw," said another voice. "And the Oruk." 3 species in 3 minutes, and by the end of the day 2 more had followed, and the conclave of 12 was the conclave of 7, and shrinking, and the cracks were spreading faster than anyone could repair them. Because the Battle of Cathara had not just been a military defeat, it had been a revelation. For thousands of years, the elder species had maintained their power through a simple and unspoken agreement. They were the strongest. They made the rules, and everyone else obeyed, because the alternative was destruction. But now the galaxy had seen that the strongest could be beaten, and that changed everything. On the Kreth homeworld, the Hive Queens calculated the new balance of power, and did not like the numbers. And for the first time in recorded history, the Dominion began recalling its fleets from occupied territories, because holding those territories suddenly seemed less important than defending the homeland. The Polari network ran simulations of a war with humanity, and every simulation ended the same way, not with a clear human victory, but with losses so catastrophic that the network would be crippled for centuries, and the Polari had not survived this long by fighting wars they could not win. Trade routes that had been controlled by the Conclave for millennia were suddenly opened because the ships that had patrolled them were debris in the Kethara void. And the junior species, the ones who had been taxed and regulated and kept in their place by the elder races, began moving into those routes and claiming them for themselves. 3 vassal worlds declared independence in a single week. The revolutions were not violent because they did not need to be. The junior species simply looked at the Conclave and said no, and for the first time in galactic history, the Conclave did not have the strength to make them say yes. The economic consequences were staggering, because the Conclave's economy was built on the assumption that the elder species controlled everything. And when that control slipped, the markets collapsed, trade agreements fell apart, and species that had been dependent on Conclave infrastructure were suddenly forced to build their own. The Veitari war economy buckled under the weight of 213 lost warships, because ships were expensive and crews were irreplaceable, and the taxes needed to rebuild would have crushed a population that was already questioning why they had sent an armada against one ship in the first place. On Earth, the reaction was different. There was anger at first, because 21 people had died on the Erebus, and their faces were on every screen, were spoken in every home. And the public wanted to know why the Conclave had attacked a peaceful exploration vessel, and why nobody had stopped it. But the anger cooled, and what replaced it was something more complicated. A mixture of pride and grief and a quiet determination that this would never happen again. The Terran government formally revealed the existence of the Phalanx program, and the revelation divided opinion because some people were proud that humanity had been prepared, and others were disturbed that their government had been secretly building weapons of mass destruction for 20 years. Captain Naren Voss was brought home on a medical transport, and she spent 3 months in a hospital, while doctors repaired her broken ribs and her fractured arm, and the dozens of smaller injuries that she had been ignoring since the battle. She would walk with a slight limp for the rest of her life, and her left hand would never quite close properly again. Was alive, and so were 21 of her crew, and she held on to that like a lifeline. The families of the 21 who did not come home were given medals and letters and all the empty honors that governments offer when they cannot give back the only thing that matters. And Voss attended every single funeral because she had been their captain, and that meant something to her that no amount of pain could diminish. 6 months after the battle, the Conclave formally dissolved. It did not happen with a dramatic announcement or a final vote. It simply stopped functioning because there were not enough members left to make decisions. And the members who remained could not agree on anything except that the old ways were over. In its place, a new body was proposed, the Galactic Accord, built on a principle that the Conclave had never embraced: equal representation for every spacefaring species, regardless of how long they had been in space. The humans supported it, and one by one, species after species signed on, because the alternative was chaos, and nobody wanted chaos. Not even the Veithari, who joined last and with visible reluctance. Humanity was offered a founding seat at the table, and the representative they sent was not a politician or a general, but a diplomat named James Osei, Kaida's father, who had spent his entire career arguing that humanity's place in the galaxy should be earned through cooperation and not through force. "We did not want this war," he told the First Assembly of the Galactic Accord in a speech that was broadcast to every inhabited world. "We have never wanted war with any species, and the weapons we built in secret were not instruments of aggression, but insurance policies against the day that someone decided we did not have the right to exist. And I truly hope, that we never need to use them again." The assembly was quiet for a long time after he. Cephas of the Eldrani broke the silence. "I voted against the Armada," she said, "and I take no satisfaction in being right, because being right cost lives on both sides, and the only thing worse than a war is a war that did not need to happen." She looked at the human delegation. "But I will say this, in all my years and in all my study of the species that fill this galaxy, I have never encountered a people who fight so hard to survive, and then extend their hand to the enemy they have just defeated. And I think that is the most remarkable thing about humans. Not your weapons and not your ships, but your stubborn and irrational insistence on offering mercy to those who showed you none." The Galactic Accord was ratified that day. The juvenile species classification was abolished. And across the galaxy, things began to change in ways that were slow and uneven and messy, because that is how change always works. Not in great dramatic sweeps, but in small moments that accumulate over time, until the world you live in is different from the world you were born into. 1 year after the battle, Captain Marin Voss sat on the porch of a small house on a human colony world called New Meridian, and the sky above her was turning orange and purple as the planet's twin suns set behind a range of blue mountains. She was retired now because the military had offered her a promotion and a desk, and she had declined both, saying that she had spent enough time in space, and that what she wanted now was solid ground under her feet, and a sky she could see without looking through a window. A datapad sat on the table beside her, and the screen showed a news broadcast. First contact with a previously unknown species discovered by a Terran survey vessel operating in the far rim, and the contact had been peaceful, and the new species was being welcomed into the Galactic Accord. The survey vessel's name was the Erebus II. Picked up the datapad, and looked at the image of the ship on the screen, sleek and new and beautiful, carrying a crew of scientists and explorers who were going further than anyone had gone before. And she thought about the 43 people who had flown the first Erebus into the unknown, and the 21 who had not come back. She thought about Kaida, who was now the Erebus II's first officer, and about Tomas, who was its chief engineer, and about Davi, who had been fitted with a prosthetic hand that worked better than the original, and who was serving as the communications officer because he said someone had to make sure the new crew did not get lost. She thought about the 21 names carved into the memorial wall at Terran Expeditionary Command, and she said each name quietly to herself the way she did every evening, because she had promised herself she would never forget them. The sun set, and the stars came out, and they were different stars than the ones she had grown up with, but they were beautiful all the same, and somewhere out there among them, the Erebus II was flying into the unknown, carrying the best of what humanity had to offer. Voss set the datapad down and leaned back in her chair and looked up at the sky. She did not smile exactly, but something in her face softened, and something in her eyes caught the starlight and held it. And if you had been standing there watching, you might have thought she looked like a woman who had made peace with everything she had lost and everything she had gained. The galaxy had sent an armada against one ship. The galaxy had paid for it, and humanity was still here, still reaching for the stars, still stubborn and reckless and compassionate and impossible, still human. The stars burned on above her, and the night was quiet, and somewhere in the distance, a bird that was not really a bird, sang a song that sounded almost like home.